And then lastly, before I hand over to our director, we are an NGO, so donations are of course welcome so that we can continue with these programs. Jordan will create a link and put it on the chat. And that link will enable you to simply click on that and make your donation without much hassle. So at this point in time, I'm going to hand over to our Executive Director, Tali Nates.
Thank you very much, Mdu. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. This very chilly and dark, this load shedding in Johannesburg evening, but it is really warm welcome to all of you. As you heard, my name is Tali Nates, and I am the director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. It is wonderful to see so many friends from around the world here tonight. We have with us long-standing friends and also some new friends. We have friends from all over South Africa, from Israel, from the UK, from the US, from Canada, from Poland, from Denmark, from Australia, from Germany, from Lithuania. It is really wonderful to see members of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center Board of Trustees, to see our partners, our long-standing supporters and donors, to welcome some of our dear Holocaust survivors, including our dear Veronica Phillips that is joining us on Zoom tonight. Also a very warm welcome to our colleagues and friends from the 3 Holocaust and Genocide Centers in South Africa, from Durban, from Cape Town, and of course, all the members and friends from Johannesburg. It is really wonderful to see you all here. So who are we? To those of you that are new and joined us for the first time, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center is a place of memory, education, and lessons for humanity. We explore the history of genocides in the 20th century, but we focus on the history of the Holocaust and of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. We also encourage students, teachers, and the public to make connections between memories of the past and challenges of society today. And we at the center have great interest in learning about how societies and countries are confronting and dealing with their painful and difficult past. And we welcome very much the discussion tonight exactly about that difficult past. An important theme in our exhibition and education programs is choices and dilemmas. We explore stories of individuals, communities, and governments that made choices during the Holocaust and continue to make choices today. And again, this webinar tonight speaks exactly to that point. It is crucial to examine the actions of different role players, such as collaborators, resistors, rescuers, bystanders, and perpetrators, as well as talking, of course, about the survivors and the victims. Now, the majority of Jews living in South Africa today are descendants of Jewish immigrants from Lithuania and Latvia, who came to South Africa between 1880s and the majority came up to 1930 before the Quota Act that was passed in 1930. They were seeking refuge from poverty, anti-Semitism, and discrimination. And they found a safe haven in South Africa. We have some survivors still with us from Lithuania, and we had many other survivors that passed away from Lithuania and Latvia in our community. The webinar tonight is based on Dr. Efraim Zuroff and Rūta Vanagaitė book, Our People, Discovering Lithuania's Hidden Holocaust. Thus, it is of great interest to all of us and all who joined us tonight. Tonight's webinar will start with a presentation, first historical presentation from Dr. Zuroff, and then a more personal journey presentation from Mrs. Rūta Vanagaitė. It will be followed then by a reading from their book, which is available, by the way, for purchase, many of you asked, on Amazon, on lut.co.za, and on Kindle, and hopefully when we reopen, also in our coffee shop and bookstore. Finally, I will start the conversation after the book reading by asking both Rūta and Efraim just a few questions, and then opening to you, the audience, to ask your questions, which Mdu and the team will manage through the chat. I invite all of you not to forget to post your questions throughout the webinar in our chat, and our team will gather the questions and pose them after to Efraim and Rūta. It is my pleasure now to introduce our speakers to you. Let me start with ladies first, and I'll start to introduce Rūta Vanagaitė to you. Rūta is a Lithuanian journalist and author. In 1993, she won the Woman of the Year award in Lithuania. Her third best-selling book, Our People, co-authored with Efraim Zuroff, Israeli historian and Nazi hunter, deals with the complicity of Lithuanians in Holocaust crimes. The book was published in Lithuania in 2016 and created a national scandal. In 2016, she won the Medal of Valor, an annual award by Simon Wiesenthal Center. However, in October of 2017, all Vanagaitė's books, 6 titles, 27,000 books, copies altogether, were removed from the bookshelves in Lithuania after Rūta's critical comment about one of their national heroes. In 2018, Rūta won other prestigious European awards. Rūta has written a second part of the book, Our People, How Did It Happen?, with renowned German historian, Dr. Christoph Dickmann. The book is basically being launched now in Vilnius, where Rūta is joining us from tonight, but she is currently living in Israel. Let me introduce to you to Efraim Zuroff. Dr. Efraim Zuroff is, of course, a renowned, to South Africa, very much renowned Holocaust historian. He is the chief Nazi hunter of the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the director of the center's Israel office and Eastern European affairs. For 4 decades, he has played a major role in facilitating the prosecution of many Nazi war criminals all over the world. He is the author of 4 books, translated into 15 languages, and numerous articles on Holocaust-related issues and their impact on the Jewish world. A recipient of many honors and awards, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008. Efraim visited South Africa before. He's a friend of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and it's wonderful to have you here with us tonight. I'll invite now everyone to put the screen on speaker view and invite Efraim to start his comments.
Okay.
Bugsy, I can't hear the sound.
Efraim, you are on mute. So just unmute yourself and we can start.
Muting myself. I wanted to thank Tali and the staff at the Johannesburg Holocaust Center for organizing this evening. This evening is quite special for me, I have to tell you, because I have many relatives in South Africa. two of my grandfather's brothers, he was one of 6 boys, emigrated to South Africa, and many of their descendants are still living in the country. Anyway, tonight is about a phenomenon that is not going on only in Lithuania. We're talking about something called Holocaust distortion. And I think I should begin with a definition of that term because it's not exactly clear. This is not denial. The countries where this is prevalent, and we're talking about almost every country in post-communist Eastern Europe, do not deny that the Holocaust took place. They actually can't deny it because it took place on their territory, of many of them. But what they're trying to do is to change the narrative of the Holocaust, primarily to hide their own crimes and to deflect the blame. But we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. In any event, in order to understand the issue, we have to deal with the question of collaboration with the Nazis. In every country occupied by or allied with Nazi Germany, the Nazis tried to enlist local helpers. And there were 3 reasons for that. 1 ideological reason and 2 practical reasons. The ideological reason was that they wanted to show that the local population everywhere supported the measures that they're taking against the people referred to as enemies of the Reich, primarily Jews, but also communists, homosexuals, mentally ill, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. The practical reasons were that the Nazis controlled an area, a huge area of Europe, every part of Europe with the exception of the neutrals. In other words, from the beaches of Normandy in the west, all the way to the gates of Moscow and Leningrad, from Narvik and Trondheim in the north of Norway to the Greek islands, with the exception of Spain and Portugal, Switzerland, Sweden, Ireland, and Turkey. All the rest was either occupied by the Nazis or allied with Nazi Germany. Now, so first of all, they were shorthanded. They didn't have sufficient manpower to control these areas to the extent that they wanted to. And obviously, every local person whom they can convince to join them frees a German from Hamburg or from Berlin or an Austrian from Vienna to go someplace where they were more needed. The second thing is that they're about to launch an unprecedented mass murder operation. And they come to a country like Lithuania. They don't know the language. They don't know the topography. They don't know the geography. The murders initially are carried out individually. This is before the gas chamber started. So obviously, they need a lot of help in carrying out the murders and choosing the murder sites and hiding the corpses, etc. And the sad truth is that in every country, either in occupied Europe, occupied with Germany, by Germany, or allied with Germany, they were able to find willing, zealous helpers. And these people played a very important role in the implementation of what the Nazis called the final solution, their plan to annihilate all the Jews, ultimately of the world, initially of Europe and then of the world. Now, there's one thing that's very important to remember, and that is the difference between the nature of collaboration with the Nazis in Eastern Europe and in the rest of the continent. Outside of Eastern Europe, the local helpers assisted Nazis in implementing the initial stages of the final solution, defining who was a Jew, passing discriminatory legislation, preventing the Jews from having a normal life, stealing their property, stealing their valuables, etc. But the collaboration, in a sense, ended primarily at the train station or at the harbor. In other words, they did not ask those helpers outside of Eastern Europe to carry out the murders. They helped the Nazis, in other words, discriminate against the Jews, round them up, and then the Jews were sent somewhere else to be murdered by someone else. In other words, the Vichy police did not murder the Jews. I'm talking about systematic murder, not sporadic murders. The Dutch NSB, the Nazi Party of the Holland, were not the ones who carried out the murder. All these Jews were sent either primarily by trains, in some places by boats, like from Norway and from the Greek islands, to Eastern Europe, where they were murdered by the Nazis and their local helpers. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Croatia. In all these countries, local helpers were actually incorporated into the process of mass annihilation, which was not the case outside of Eastern Europe. Now, when these countries, when the war ended and the Russians liberated, in quotation marks, liberated these areas, they didn't become Western liberal democracies. They basically exchanged a Nazi dictatorship for either for a Soviet dictatorship, or they were under communism. In other words, some of those areas became Soviet republics, like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Others, like Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic, Yugoslavia, they were not part of the Soviet Union, but they were dominated by the Communist Party. And during that period, the communists made a certain manipulation, I would say, or distortion of the facts about the Holocaust and World War II. By the way, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Eastern Europe, and especially in the Soviet Union, they never referred to World War II as World War II. They called it the Great Patriotic War. In other words, a battle of the ideological titans, Nazism against Bolshevism. And luckily for the world, the Soviet Union, with all its flaws, and I don't want to in any way minimize communist crimes, they were able to help the Western Allies defeat Nazi Germany and save us from Nazism. But as a result, in other words, there was very little information about the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, and the unique fate, the uniquely tragic fate of the Jews of Eastern Europe was never acknowledged by the Soviets. And I want to illustrate that with a case that I'm sure many of you have heard of, which is the story of Babi Yar. Babi Yar was the site of the largest massacre in the history of the Shoah. In other words, in the course of 2 days, September 29th, 30th, 1941, 33,771 people, primarily Jews, but not only Jews, were murdered by Einsatzgruppe C and the Ukrainian security police. How do we know the exact number? We know the exact number because there was an exhumation of the bodies. And they know down to the precise figure of the victims. Now, for many years, this site was not marked. There was no museum. There was not even a monument. And then some genius, in quotation marks, in the Kiev municipality came up with the idea of building a football stadium on Babi Yar. I mean, you can imagine. And thank God, the Russian poet, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, not a Jew, came out, he published his famous poem, Babi Yar, which was basically a cry on behalf of the victims, which prevented or forced the Soviets in Ukraine to shelve that idea. And instead, a little monument was made initially, and it bore the caption, "To the victims of fascism." Very interesting caption. What does it hide? First of all, it hides the identity of the victims. The victims were primarily Jews. And it hides the identity of the perpetrators. The perpetrators were not only Nazis, Wehrmacht, in other words, SS people, they were actually local people as well. Now, the reasons that this was done throughout communist areas and throughout the Soviet Union. By the way, if you went to Ponar, which is the place where 70,000 Jews were murdered outside Vilna, had the same caption. Rumbula, outside Riga, where 25 to 30,000 Jews were murdered, same caption. Mali Trustinitz, where 100,000 Jews were murdered outside Minsk, the same caption. So why didn't they want to tell the truth? They didn't want to tell the truth, first of all, because they didn't want to acknowledge the unique fate of the Jews and do anything which might acknowledge Jewish peoplehood. I'm sure many of you remember our struggle all over the Jewish world to free the Soviet Jews, enable them to come home to Israel. In the Soviet Union, there were no Jewish schools for many years, for decades. There was no Jewish communal organizations. All there was, they allowed one synagogue in the large cities. They allowed people to bake matzot before Pesach. That was more or less it. They had campaigns against circumcision, campaigns against Judaism, and life for the Soviet Jews was very terrible, and the authorities were not willing to acknowledge their suffering. And as far as the question of the perpetrators goes, what bound together the people in the Soviet Union? You had people from 100 nationalities, more than 100 nationalities. Well, according to communist ideology, they were bound together by socialism, brothers in socialism. Lithuanian communists with Belarusian communists, with Kazakh communists, the Yakut communists, and God knows what else, and Jewish communists as well. But 1 second, if they were bound together in communism, how could Ukrainian communists murder their Jewish neighbors? That didn't fit the story. So in other words, it was only when the Soviet Union crumbled in 1990, in 89 in Romania, in 1990 in the Baltics, 91 elsewhere, that for the first time, these countries were able to learn the truth and teach the truth about what actually had happened during World War II and during the Shoah. But the problem was the narrative, the true story, the accurate story of what was happening, what had happened, was very, very difficult because their own people were among the murderers. And in some places, they played an incredibly significant role. And in that respect, Lithuania stands out. And I'll explain to you why. In Lithuania, there were 220,000 Jews who lived under the Nazi occupation. 212,000 were murdered. 90% of them were murdered near their homes, in sites, usually in forests, where they were shot. Only towards the end of the war, 10% were sent to camps. Some were sent to Stutthof, some were sent to, the men were sent to Dachau, the women to Stutthof and to other camps. These were the survivors of the ghettos of Kovna, of Vilna and Shalai, and many of them died there. But in other words, the overwhelming majority of the people were shot, I would say, most probably by Lithuanians. There were places where Lithuanians alone carried out the murders. There were places where the only Germans present were photographing, weren't even shooting. And there were other places where Lithuanians and Nazis, Einsatzgruppen, SS people, did carry out the murders. So this is something that is very hard to deal with. But on the other hand, the subject of the Holocaust all of a sudden became very important for these Eastern European countries when they became independent. And the reason was that their greatest fear was that the Russians will come back. And the question was, how can they protect themselves from a return, not, in this case, not the Soviet Union anymore, but Russia, the Russian Federation. I mean, a small country like Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia has no chance to defend itself against the Russian army. So who's going to save them? Who's going to protect them? NATO and the European Union. But in order to get into the NATO or the European Union, they thought that it would be very important to mend defenses with the Jews, to make up with the Jews, because the Jews have a lot of influence. I don't know how many of you are acquainted with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, this famous book, which is supposedly is all about a Jewish conspiracy to control the world. But if there's anywhere where they believe it, it's in Eastern Europe. So it was obvious that they have to make nice to Israel and primarily to American Jewry, but also to the Jewish communities. So how do they do that? How do they, on the one hand, deal with the Holocaust? On the other hand, save, in other words, not tell the whole truth, because that would be absolutely terrible. So this is what we're seeing. Today, we're more than 25 years after independence. We see exactly what they're doing, what they're not doing. There were 6 issues that they had to deal with when they became independent. One was acknowledgement of guilt and an apology. 2 is commemoration of the victims. 3 is prosecution of the perpetrators who hadn't been brought to justice. 4 is rewriting the history books, because all the history books were communist propaganda. 5 is education. textbooks, of course, and restitution. And I'm sorry to say that very little has been done in that sphere all over Eastern Europe, because the problem is the narrative. You can go to a ceremony about the Holocaust. You can go to quite a few ceremonies about the Holocaust in Lithuania. They'll tell you what a tragedy it was. The Nazis came to our country and murdered our Jews. If you press them, then they'll say, well, there were a few degenerates. And basically, what their aim is the following. One is to minimize or hide their own crimes. Two is to create a false symmetry between communist crimes and Nazi crimes, as if they're the same or even worse. Now that's important because and they insist that communist crimes be called genocide, be categorized as genocide, because if communist crimes are genocide, that means that Jews committed genocide. And if Jews committed genocide, that means that if everyone's guilty, then no one is guilty. The third point is that quite a few of their heroes, who are the people who fought against the communists after World War II, were involved in Holocaust crimes, which in theory should have disqualified them from becoming national heroes. And the fourth is that they're pushing for an international Remembrance Day for all the victims of totalitarian regimes, i.e. communism and Nazism. And obviously, if such a day were observed, that would make International Holocaust Day totally superfluous. So Rūta and I went on a mission to try and find out the truth about what actually took place in Lithuania, to interview survivors, to interview eyewitnesses, to see what is written about the Holocaust and the fate of the Jews and the Jewish community in public museums. And what we found, I have to say, was very, very sad, very disheartening, and infuriating. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. One of the reasons that Rūta and I cooperated together was her, to me, an amazing admission that she made to me when I first met her, which was that she acknowledged that two relatives of hers, whom she had actually never met, her grandfather and her aunt's husband, had been actively involved in persecuting the Jews. And she's the first person I ever met in Lithuania. I've been going to Lithuania dozens and dozens of times. I never met a single person in Lithuania who admitted to me that anyone of his family, anyone connected to him or them, had actually been a participant. So her willingness, her acknowledgement of that, and her willingness to atone for it, which I found, obviously I was quite shocked, I have to admit, but it's a very praiseworthy thing that she did. So we teamed together. We spent 40 days going from mass murder site to mass murder site, not only in Lithuania, but also in Belarus, where there was a Lithuanian unit was sent to kill Jews in Belarus. And it was a heartbreaking journey, and that's the result. The book is the result, in a sense, a living monument, or our way of commemorating the victims of the Shoah in Lithuania.
Efraim, I wonder if you can just add 2-3 words about your family in South Africa that were from Lithuania before we move to Rūta.
Okay, my maternal grandparents were both born in Lithuania. My grandfather was born in a shtetl in northeastern Lithuania called Ligmian. Today, Likmenis in Lithuania, no Jews left there, of course. And my grandmother was born in Šeduva. Now, they left before World War I. My grandfather was one of 6 boys. 5 of them left before World War I. They left one went to Eretz Israel. That's my uncle Herschel. There were 2 brothers went to South Africa, Nissan and Shimon. One went to Johannesburg, the other one initially to Rustenburg, then to Remfontein, then to Johannesburg. And one ended up in Scotland. and one remained. The one who remained is this is my great uncle, my mother's uncle, Rabbi Efraim Zuroff. And my grandfather, who was in the United States, had arranged a visa for him to America, but unfortunately he decided not to take it. Maybe he had some reservations about Jewish life in America. And the truth is, I was supposed to have a different name. I'm actually named for him, but I was supposed to have a different name. When I was born, my father sent a cable to his father-in-law, who had been sent by the Joint Distribution Committee to help the survivors in Europe. And my grandfather was in charge of caring for all the religious needs of the survivors. He was one of the people who had a Shas printed in Munich, the first Shas printed after World War II. And when he heard the news, he immediately sent back a cable, suggest name him Ephraim. Now, my parents had two different names already, and they discarded those names, and I became Ephraim. And the irony of the story is that I, at one point, actually found out what happened to him. And the story is that I knew that he had studied in the Radin Yeshiva, and before I was invited to Lithuania for the dedication of the monument at Ponar, I called the yeshiva, which was like the continuation of that school, and asked if there are any survivors alive who I can ask if they knew what happened to my uncle, my great uncle. They said there's one survivor named Kalman Farber who lives in Jerusalem, but I couldn't find him. And then we flew to Vilna, but we flew via Riga. And we were outside the Riga airport waiting for a bus to take us to Vilna. And all of a sudden, I see a suitcase with a name tag, Kalman Farber. And so I was totally in shock. And then I waited to see who was going to take the release. All of a sudden, a young man comes up who obviously can't be Kalman Farber. So I said to him, "Are you Kalman Farber's son?" He says, "Yes, and my father's right here." So I went over to him, I explained to him who I am and what I want to know. He said, "What was your great uncle's name?" I said, "Efraim Zuroff." Thinking, he said, "Listen, I'm sorry, I don't know." We get on the bus, 15 minutes later, he comes and sits down next to me. And he says to me, "1 second, what shtetl was your great uncle from?" I go, "Ligminyan." You should have seen his face. He was in absolute shock. And he sat with me and told me all about my great uncle, what a brilliant Talmud scholar he was, what a happy person he was. And he actually met him after both of them had run away to Vilna to try and escape the Russians. But unfortunately, my great uncle was murdered, and I know how exactly because he told me, on the 17th day of Tammuz, which we just marked last week, a fast day, when the walls of Jerusalem were breached, there were Lithuanian gangs. This was July 13th, 1941. There were Lithuanian gangs roaming the city looking for Jews with beards. And he was one of those Jews. He was taken to Lukashka's prison, and from there apparently to Ponar, where he was murdered. Later on, his wife Bela and his 2 sons, Hirsch and Eliyahu, were also murdered. So this whole mission, my efforts to get the Lithuanians to prosecute the Nazi war criminals, is certainly something very personal for me, even though I try not to make it personal. But it's something that touched me very deeply. And the trip and the mission to go from place to place was absolutely heartbreaking, I have to say. Worse than anything I've ever done. And I've been to all the death camps. Very personal.
Thank you, Ephraim. And we will go back to you after Rūta shares with us her thoughts and reflections. So Rūta, Ephraim, if you can mute your mic, and Rūta, if you can unmute yours. And yes, wonderful.
Hello, everybody. I'm Rūta, and I'm living not in Jerusalem. I'm living in Vilnius, in Lithuania at the moment. I came back to my homeland, and I'm sitting here in front of the wonderful pine forest. And first of all, I want to tell all the people whose ancestors left Lithuania like 100 or more years ago. Lucky you are. Because what happened in these pine forests, it was not such a lucky thing. So I love the forest I love my country, but my country is dotted with mass murder sites, 234 places. And if you see this forest, it's one of these forests. And first of all, I want to really deeply apologize. I'm not Jewish, but I really care. I started caring recently, you know, like 5 years ago. And I'm happy that you are alive. And I really care that my country should finally realize what our ancestors did. Okay, so I'm not Jewish. Even if my nose is really, you know, in Lithuania, they think I'm Jewish because my family name Vanagaitė means a hawk. But my father has a, you know, the same nose, you know, a hawk. I have a hawk nose. Okay. So, and what I want to say that sometimes Jews think that we Lithuanians are, or other countries are anti-Semitic. We are not. We're just deeply indifferent. If you talk to Ukrainians, if you talk to Polish people, Latvian people, Lithuanian people, like talking about the Jews is like talking about a crusade or whatever. I mean, we don't care. And for so many years of my life, like 60, maybe 62, 65 years, I couldn't care less. And my children don't care. And my friends don't care. And it takes a lot of effort to start caring. Like every country is, every nation is obsessed with themselves. Like Jews are obsessed with themselves. Like everybody is obsessed with themselves. Like we Lithuanians, we are heroes, we are victims, we are whatever. And we don't care about the others. And it took me, like I knew about my two relatives. I knew about my grandfather who made the list of, in 41, he made a list of 10 Soviet activists, which were like one of them was like, had a Jewish name, but I mean, they were all shot. Okay, who cares? And they had my aunt's husband, who was like chief of police in Ponevich. And then he fled Lithuania in 44 because he was something good to do with the Jews. I always knew about it, but I couldn't care less. So the problem is that, you know, when Jewish people think that we are like anti-Semitic or we are like righteous or whatever, basically indifference is the answer. And to fight indifference was my mission together with Efraim to change it. And when I first, you know, got involved into the whole business was when I went to the special archives, and they start reading the interrogation protocols of the murderers. You know, we Lithuanians, we think, okay, the Jews we don't care about, okay, Jews are the Jews. And then if somebody was killing the Jews, it was like Efraim said, they were like degenerates and monsters, and they did it because somebody, you know, if they wouldn't have shot the Jews, you know, the Germans would have shot them. That's what we think. And then I came to the archives and I read the interrogation protocols of these murderers. And I realized they're just regular people. I can see you just one example, one simple example. There's a guy from a city called Tavrak, you know, his name Antanas Szewczuk, who was 18 years old. He was studying in a teacher's academy, and for summer he didn't have anything to do, so somebody told that he has to register, you know, the Jewish property, okay? So, you know, if you hear me, it's okay? Anyway, so he went there because they said that, you know, if you register, you know, some of the property, not everything, so you might, you know, get, you know, a little bit more, improve your material situation. So we went there, he registered because he didn't know, you know, what's happening with the Jews, you know, who cares? And then they told him to take the Jews from one place, from the synagogue or the school, to some other place. And he was convoying them. And then he heard, Stefan Szewczuk, his name, he heard that the shootings. And then he realized that the Jews are being shot there at the pits. And he thought to himself, anyway, these Jews will be shot. And then he started coming to these people and telling them, you know what? You're gonna die anyway. So these bad people are gonna take your property. And I'm young, I'm a teacher. So why don't you give me your watch? Why don't you give me your money? And they start giving it. So it's like, you know, like people are not choosing to be murderers. They are sliding into the crime. And it was very important for me to realize and to write about it. Because it's not like Jews think that Lithuanians are murderers, whatever. People are weak and they are not choosing to be murderers. They are sliding into it. And when we went to with Efraim, you know, to these mass murder sites and starting to interview the witnesses, what was the most important for both of us, that, you know, there are no living murderers. Because it's okay? Hello?
Yes, we hear you. It's all okay.
I'm just saying that, look, if we went only to 40 or 50 different places. And we drive with the car, which was called Shoah Mobile. Efraim called it Shoah Mobile. And we see somebody who is really old in the main square of the city, whatever city. And then we ask him to show us to the place. We go to the place, and at mass murder site, we go to the closest hut, to the closest place where somebody is living. And we enter the place and we ask them, the old woman or old man, have you seen anything? Do you remember what happened? And they remember. There are no murders left, but the witnesses left. Because those people who saw the murders in 41, they have been, you know, like 6 years old, 7 years old, they remember everything. And they stand there and they cry. And they tell us. So, like, actually my mission is to, together with Efraim, but for me as Lithuanian, you know, to record it. And like now, a lot of people are writing to me, say, have you been to this place? Have you been to this place? Are you going to write another book? Because they want their family stories to be recorded. 240 stories. So anyway, my books were removed from the bookshelves, and I was kind of broken. Then I spent 2.5 years in Israel with a lot of wonderful people. And now I came back with another book. And I want to prove that nobody can be broken. I am for the victims. Every time when I have this talk, you know, Zoom or not Zoom, I sit for 10 minutes and think about the victims. And I'm becoming strong. Thank you. I'm ready for the questions.
Thank you, Rūta. Rūta and Efraim, I will invite you now to read your choice of a portion of the book that to get us into understanding your journey and your research.
Okay, so I chose two very short dialogues, but they're very important because they are the dialogues that we had after we left Linkmenis, where my grandfather was born, and after we left Kavarskas, where Rūta's grandfather was born, okay? So let me begin. The proximity of the homes of the residents of Lithuanians to the mass murder site is shocking. As if it is normal for people to come and live in a place like that. As if this murder was some kind of normal event.
Listen, they did not come to live next to mass murder site by choice. Their grandparents and parents had lived here for ages. It was their home, their land. They belong here. Where they were supposed to go.
These people do not want to talk about what happened here. Maybe they have some kind of connection to this horrible event. They might say something they don't want to say. They might arouse memories they don't want to deal with. People, their neighbors, were wiped out, as if they never existed. All their things, even tablecloths, were stolen. Going from Kaddish to Kaddish to Kaddish, Pabrera, Schwanzionelli, Polygon, Linkmenis, in such a small geographic area, mass murder after mass murder after mass murder. You want to yell and say to the world, how could this have happened?
Were you surprised that people didn't want to speak?
Yes and no. You would assume that since so many years have passed, you can open up. I have a sense that these people are hiding something. They refuse to talk out of fear or out of solidarity with other people, their neighbors. They were more scared of you than of me, who's an outsider, because you are on television. They don't want Lithuanian TV to broadcast that they have been talking about the mass murders in Lithuania.
These people are old, they live alone, and they are afraid.
Let's talk about the element of fear. You say that because the people saw shootings, they think it can happen again. And that is one of the motivations not to talk.
People are afraid to talk, and I fully understand them. Their grandparents, their parents, and they themselves have gone through so many upheavals and traumas that for them it's safer not to talk. If you talk, anything can happen. If you don't talk, you're much safer. There's a Russian saying, be more silent than water, be lower than the grass. Another thing, when they were very young, they saw the neighbors being shot by other neighbors. So if anything changes, a new war or anything like that, the same thing might happen to them. They know that since murder was possible once, it can happen again. And one other thing, if you admit that you have witnessed a crime, the person who committed it or his relatives might come after you and take revenge. People in Lithuania who have seen a crime most probably would not testify because they would be afraid that the criminal or his friends would one day come out of prison and take revenge.
The second argument is totally idiotic, you'll excuse me, because almost all the murderers are dead. And even if they were not dead, how many 90-year-olds do you think are going around murdering people? I want to address another thing. You said they saw the murders. You must remember something. The murder sites were in isolated places, specifically chosen so there would not be any witnesses except the shooters and those helping to dispose of the bodies. They saw people being taken out, not being shot.
They heard the shooting. Afterwards, in every village, they were talking about what had happened and how the earth moved several days after the massacre and bloody shirts were washed in the streams. They still talk about this among themselves.
Maybe it's true for some people. Is it possible that people start magnifying everything afterwards?
Experiencing the Holocaust is horrifying for those who witnessed it as a kid. Until now, nobody has talked about it in public, on TV or radio. It is so surprising. If the police do not investigate the crime, you would not start your own investigation. If nobody ever spoke about this, about the crime remains a secret. Who are you, an old, lonely woman living in a village, to speak about this? Why you? Why now? For what reason? It will not bring the victims back to life.
It is exactly the opposite of what should have happened. If the police do not solve the case and you have the information, you should be going to the police. She's 90 years old? Okay, why did she not do it before? I can understand why she would not go to the Soviets, but Lithuania has been independent already for 25 years. There's our initiative, Operation Last Chance, which offered money for the information. Our ads were in all the newspapers in Lithuania. Why all you talk about is fear? You're living in a democratic country, a member of the European Union, for God's sake.
Just remember, maybe some of their neighbors were killers, or they were marching Jews to the pits, or took their property. The children of those people are living next door, or if not, they're living somewhere close by. If you start talking about what your neighbor did, your family will stop you. The whole village will think that you are a traitor. When I start talking about writing this book and about my relatives and their role in the Holocaust, some of my relatives got very upset. I might be condemned by my family. I might become a black sheep. Do I want that?
But listen, someone has to pay the price for the crimes committed.
Why me? If the government doesn't do it, if the police doesn't do it, do you understand how much courage a person needs to speak out?
You're right. It takes a lot of guts. And what you're doing is super important.
I am not 90 years old. I don't live in a lonely house next to the forest. I'm not talking about my neighbors from the same village. I'm ready to become a black sheep in my family because I believe in what I'm doing. If not me, who? If not now, when? But you know what? If my grandfather would have shot the Jews personally, I would not be able to talk about this issue. It would have been too painful for me. I know, I'm sure, that no one in my family ever pulled the trigger.
How can you be certain? You just don't know. Coming back to the issue of fear, you are trying to say that because people lived such a long time under the Soviet regime, they're scared of talking, scared of relating to the terrible tragedy that took place here. My question to you is, at what point does that stop being an excuse? If someone had a terrible childhood, at some point he or she has to take responsibility for their life and not blame their parents all the time.
We're not talking about someone's childhood. We're talking about entire life on an adult. That makes a big difference.
Okay, so in other words, in 25 years from now, they will start talking?
By then they will be dead. Now they are already very old, and old age is not the right time to become a hero.
So the only way for us to achieve what we want to achieve, to make an impact with this book, is to address the younger generation who did not live under the Soviets. But it also means that you are giving the older generation, including the government, a free pass.
No, the government doesn't want the truth to come out because politicians want to be re-elected. They want to be popular with their voters. But even for me, if I knew what my neighbor was killing, that my neighbor was killing people, it would be difficult to go to the police and give him up. In Lithuanian culture, to be a police informer, to inform on your neighbor, it's a sin. It's a sin of betrayal. You would not testify about the crimes of your neighbor's father or grandfather committed 70 years ago. Does it make any difference? It ruins your neighbor's life and your relations with the people living next to you. Nobody will pay attention anyway. A list of 2,055 Lithuanian Jew killers was sent by the Lithuanian Genocide Center to Lithuanian government in 2012. Do you think anything was done? Not a single step was taken against them. So tell me, who benefits if a 90-year-old woman stands up and relates on and talks on TV that her neighbor's father, who is dead now, was a killer?
What about the fact that the truth will finally come out?
Who benefits from the truth?
Lithuanian society will benefit from the truth.
What is Lithuanian society? I'm talking from the point of view of that woman.
That is the society that she lives in hopes it will become a better society.
But
I know what you're going to tell me, that she lives in a little world, in a poor little hut in Švenčionėliai. There is no society for her. It is all very sad. Now we move to Kavarskas. Okay, we are coming from Kavarskas, Kovarsk in Yiddish. And
tell you that Kavarskas is my grandfather's place.
Right, right. Ruta's grandfather lived there. And your father grew up there, right?
Yes.
Okay. And there's a sign indicating that 700 meters from the road, there's a mass murder site. But if you don't have a local guide, you would not find the place in a million years. You can completely understand why these murders were carried out there, out of sight, out of mind. If you speak to people who live nearby, no one knows anything. They know that someone came from Israel a year ago and a couple came 2 years ago, but it seems that no one comes here even on Holocaust Memorial Day in Lithuania on September 23rd. This remote corner in the brush near a river is one of the most shocking and painful places to visit. There is no indication of the number of victims or the date of the murder. The testimonies in the Soviet investigation files refers to the murder of 10 to 12 Jews, but the sources published in Israel speak about 30 to 40 people killed at this site. We also visited the synagogue, or what's left of the synagogue, which today is a private warehouse. It is not the Lithuanians' fault. Years ago, the Soviets turned the synagogue into a utility shop. We climbed the ladder to the second floor to what was once the women's gallery. This is the place where the Jews were held until they were taken to be murdered. You can only imagine the horrifically anguished prayers that the Jews must have prayed here to God to save them. Maybe they did not know what would happen to them, but I am sure that a sense of doom and a sense of some potentially horrible fate. This is just one little dot among many of the other dots on the map of Lithuania. In a book called Neighbors, the Polish historian of Jewish origin, Jan Gross, wrote about the murders in Jedwabne, where the local Jews were murdered by Poles. Poland was traumatized, and for good reason. I say to myself that right over the border, next door, there's a country full of Jedwabnes. The whole country is one big Jedwabne, and they have not yet been traumatized by these crimes. This is what we're trying to show, Rūta. Despite the fact we're coming from different sides of the fence and completely different backgrounds, on a certain level, our emotions are the same, and so is our goal. That the truth will finally become known, that it be taught and hopefully internalized.
I'm thinking about those 10 to 12 or maybe 30 to 40 Jewish men walking their last walk in the bush, down the hill, 700 meters through thick grass, led by 5 gunmen, their Lithuanian neighbors. They must have sensed what they were being thinking. I hate places like this, thick bush and high grass, bush and full of ticks, the ugliest places in Lithuania. When I see such a place, I think that someone murders me and throws my body into such a bush. I would never be found before my body rots. It's a very, very ugly last road to be taken. It's a very ugly grave. Before saying Kaddish, you showed me the snail crawling on a monument to the murdered Jews. You did not say a word, but somehow I knew you wanted me to remove the snail. So I took it away. I removed our snail from the monument to your people.
Yes, you did. Thank you. We're driving on Ukmergė Street, the main street of Kavarskas, which according to the testimonies of Holocaust survivors published in Israel, was set on fire soon after the Nazi invasion, because this was the street where the Jews lived. Ironically, Rūta's grandparents and her father also lived on this street.
I don't believe this. My father would have told me about it. He was born in 1921, so he was 20 years old then. He was studying in Kaunas, but during the summer he was back home to work on his parents' farm. My father told me about the pre-war period, and he said there was no anti-Semitism in Kavarskas before the war broke out. He had Jewish neighbors, Jewish classmates. You keep repeating at every opportunity that Lithuanians were more than eager to hurt the Jews before the Nazis arrived. There might have been some cases here and there, but I refuse to believe that this was such a widespread phenomenon. I never ever heard from my relatives about such events or attitudes over the Jews among ordinary Lithuanians. I know what happened in Lithuania after the Nazis came, but give me a break. That certainly was not the case beforehand.
Let me read you the entry on the city of Ukmergė, Vilkomer in Yiddish and Hebrew, volume 4 of Yadut Lita, Lithuanian Jewry. In Ukmergė, there were many Lithuanians who immediately after the war started, attacked Jewish homes, vandalized, tortured, and murdered.
When you say many, my heart sinks. What is many? How many? What you say makes my whole nation looks like one big monster. All 3 million people waited for years for a golden opportunity to kill their Jewish neighbors who had been living next to them for 600 years.
I did not say all Lithuanians. I said many. There were many. Ukmergė is a big city, 8,000 Jews.
How many is many?
Maybe many is 100, 50, 80, 200. What are you thinking? You're being oversensitive.
Yes, I'm sensitive when my people are attacked like this. It is normal. When you talk about like this about my country, it makes me physically sick. I feel deeply hurt by the word many.
Okay, you can start singing the Lithuanian national anthem now if it makes you feel better, like your people did when watching the murders at Lietuvos garage in Kaunas.
That is a place to end. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, because now we really have to go and get the book and read it. There are many, many questions. So I will go directly to the questions and let me read to you, and then you can decide. One of you will take, if the other one has to add, you will do that. I also prepared some questions, but we will see about time. Izzy was the first to ask, and he asked, what were the relations between Jews and Lithuanians before the war? Rūta, specifically you, that said Lithuanians were not anti-Semites, they were indifferent. Can you speak a little bit about it?
No, I would say that they're not like, like Jews were always, keeping themselves apart. So Lithuanians were like suspicious. And of course, the Catholic Church were like kind of, saying that the Jews are, a little bit dangerous. They might have killed Jesus, and they might, poison the wells and whatever. So it was like, suspicion was from Lithuanians like always, encouraged by Lithuanian Catholic Church. They were living together, but with a huge suspicion and kind of anti-Semitism / indifference.
Any
so like, I would say something, like after our book came out, the only relative of mine, none of my friends read it, nobody read it. One of my cousins read it, and I asked, Virginia, what do you think about it? She said, okay, maybe there's so many documents, maybe it's truth, but you know what? My grandmother was telling me that before Pesach, you shouldn't come out because Jews are taking little girls and putting into the barrel, and like the blood will be. So she said, I don't believe it, but I was raised with this. So there is some not genetic anti-Semitism, but the genetic prejudices in the Catholic countries, yes, they are. But actually, indifference is more important than, anti-Semitism.
Okay. Bernard Sif is asking a few questions, but maybe if you can answer one quick one. There were official investigations after the war by the Soviet Union. Were these ever published or translated? Do you know anything about it? Maybe Efraim, you know anything about that?
The investigation, the Soviets carried out many trials of Lithuanian collaborators, many of whom were involved in killing Jews. Not in every case did they cite the murder of Jews as the crime that the people were charged with. In some cases, they were charged with political crimes because they were Lithuanian nationalists and had been anti-Soviet or tried to fight against the Soviets after the war. But those trials, which are in the KGB archives, they're all in Russian, right, Rūta?
No, not all of them. Lithuanian and Russian.
Lithuanian and Russian. But it's a treasure of information regarding the killers, regarding the events. And I'll tell you one interesting thing. In 1990, Lithuania passed a rehabilitation law, which said that any person who was unfairly prosecuted by the Soviets could get rehabilitated. And it came with all sorts of financial, financial advantages. And the father of the current leader of the Lithuanian Jewish community gave me trial records of 12 people who were either in camps like Majdanek or were actively involved in the 12th Battalion, which went to Belarus, or in killing Jews in villages, and they all got rehabilitation, and that's what ultimately led. We exposed it in the New York Times the day after Lithuania became a member of the UN. And as a result, a commission was set up, which unfortunately Lithuanians didn't keep a single promise, but over 200 of these cases were canceled ultimately because of the investigations.
So it connects to another question by Bernard, and he's asking what are your views on Jonas Noreika, and will anything ever be done about him being a hero?
You know, like Hitler didn't kill anybody. Jonas Noreika didn't kill anybody, but he signed the order to send Jews from Cholet area to the ghettos, and then he signed the order to distribute their property. And personally, he took the best things. So if somebody's saying that, you know, he didn't know what he was doing, everybody knew what he was doing, and people had a choice. And he was super anti-Semitic, and he wrote anti-Semitic things, and it's like a huge shame for Lithuania to make him a national hero.
There are many, many questions, so I'll run through them quite quickly. Ilana Melamed is asking, how are you and your books accepted today in Lithuania, Rūta? I thought your books were removed, but now you are there again, and you know, you are launching the new book. How do you find society accepting you or your books?
You know, they kind of forgotten me in 2.5 years. And, you know, this book is mainly a book of Christoph Dickmann. I'm just asking questions. And, you know, that's how it was presented. I was totally insignificant. I'm not, you know, there. And I'm happy with it because the issue is much bigger than my ego. And if the launch would be without me being present, I would be happy because this I owe to the victims. My name doesn't have to be there. And but you know, the interesting thing is that I think with our people and, you know, my book with Efraim Zuroff, the nationalists, you know, reacted very fiercely, and that made the book a national bestseller. So now they chose another strategy to ignore it, which means that the book will not be a bestseller, but what can you do? So we sold like 100 or 200 books, not, you know, 2,000 books in one day, but I mean, okay, one day this book will make its path to the schools.
Yeah, is that your dream, that it will be the time that...
That's a dream. I just know what I owe to the victims.
Yeah.
It's my duty to do what I have to do. It's nothing about my ego.
Efraim, maybe you will take this one. Few people, 3 or 4 people, Gledwin and Ilana and many others, Julian, are asking about Patrick Debois and Yachad in Unum that are mapping the killing sites in Eastern Europe. And did you ever work with that organization? Is there partnerships in any way between those that are working on those mapping of killing sites?
Okay, first of all, there's no question that what Father Patrick Dubois is doing is a holy task, and he deserves enormous credit. And the truth, I feel quite uncomfortable telling you that there is absolutely no cooperation between the groups. And I have 2 criticisms of Father Dubois. One is that in his first book, which he wrote, he basically whitewashed the Ukrainians. And when I asked him why, he said, well, I'm I'm working in Ukraine. I have to continue. I said, so why don't you wait until you finish to write the book and you could tell the truth? She said, well, there'll be another book. The other point is he has information which in theory might have enabled prosecution of perpetrators, which he does not share with people like the Wiesenthal Center. So that's a shame. But having said that, I mean, what he's doing is amazing. He's doing holy work, and the fact that he's a priest plays very much in his favor and is part of what enabled him to get people to speak. I come with a kippah, he comes with a collar. That's the difference.
Thank you. Louis Zettler is asking Rūta a question, and he said, Rūta, I cannot accept that the Jews were murdered because of indifference. Europe has a history going back hundreds of years of hounding and murdering Jews. I believe that European anti-Semitism is rooted in religion, which teaches that the Jews killed Jesus Christ, and
Yes.
when in fact it was the Romans and so on. So is it indifference or is it hatred?
Look, it's both, you know, indifference of the majority of the society and hatred of the top of the government. But I think, you know, it's both, combination of both. And it's a very dangerous phenomenon. You don't, like, we have to understand that it's not, you know, the murder of the Jews is not about, you know, like perpetrators, bystanders, rescuers, is so many more complex things. Like in this new book with Dr. Christoph Dickmann, the motto of the book is that history is not black and white, it's 50 shades of gray. And when you think about how weak a human being is, how easily he can be seduced or slid into the crime, and we have to analyze it, because everything is like in ourselves. I don't know if I would have stood, you know, and seen the Jewish girl being marched, would I be able to save her? I think not. And I have to deal with this because I would think about my own children. So it's super complex and we have to analyze it.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, and maybe Efraim, and you as well, Rūta, because of the new book. There were less than 1,000 Germans in Lithuania that were involved with the Einsatzgruppen. Yet Lithuania had one of the highest percentage of death per Jewish community. Can you just unpack it a little bit, and maybe Efraim, you can start.
Let me begin. First of all, there's some things that we didn't talk about, or we barely referred to. So one thing is that the leadership of Lithuania, which many of whom, the political leaders, representatives, had run away to Berlin during the Russian occupation. You have to remember that Lithuania became independent in 1918. In 1939, they got back Vilna. Then in 1940, in June, the Soviets occupied Lithuania. During that occupation, which lasted for about a year, many of the leaders of the political parties escaped to Berlin, where they formed Lithuanian Activist Front, which professed allegiance to Nazi Germany, and especially, and not only to Nazi Germany as a country, but also to the program that was, the discrimination and steps being taken against the Jews. So at the top, you had anti-Semitism, which was sent into Lithuania by their own leaders. You had the church. So there were individual priests who saved Jews, and they fantastic people who we honor as righteous among the nations. But the leadership of the church never said a word on behalf of the Jews, never said anything to stop the murders. So this is also an element. Now, there's no question that the level of anti-Semitism in Lithuania before World War II Lithuania was not the most anti-Semitic country at all. It had a relatively low level. But the year of occupation was a factor, the leadership, the incitement, and the desire to steal Jewish property. I hate to say it, that was also an element. So all that combined, the horror of the Holocaust is that the Nazis created a set of geopolitical conditions under which it was more natural to murder a Jew than to save a Jew. And that was certainly the case in Lithuania.
There's a really interesting question from Kel from Copenhagen, from Denmark. What should the European Union have done in order not to let Lithuania and other Eastern European countries off the hook on the question of collaboration with the Nazi genocide?
Look, Israel should do something. It's not about European Union. First of all, Israeli leaders are coming. Netanyahu is coming to Lithuania and say, oh, you are the greatest. You deal with the Holocaust commemoration the best, because Israel needs Lithuanian votes. Just think, Netanyahu, his parents, ancestors are from Lithuania. Just respect it. Just say, remove this, monument for this murderer. Remove this. Stop honoring, the murderers. Why they couldn't do this?
Listen.
Efraim, do you agree?
Unfortunately, I agree with you 100%.
Why is unfortunately?
No, because the situation is unfortunate. Listen, I made Aliyah to Israel, okay? No one kicked me out of America. In those days, there was not so much anti-Semitism as today. But I went to Israel to live in a Jewish state with Jewish priorities, and it's been a horrible disappointment in that respect in terms of how Israel has treated this whole issue of distortion. So it's true that Israel has existential problems that are quite difficult, and threats that are nothing to sneeze at. But Israel is not, in other words, is a country so much stronger than Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and these other countries.
Let me tell you something. I've been working with the government, and they know that Lithuanian government, if somebody from Israel would come and say, excuse me, at the coffee, said, like, take care of this, take care of that, they would. Why
You're right. That's the sad reality. Listen, I'm trying. An NGO like the Wiesenthal Center can't solve the problem, okay? And if anything, we got a lot of flack from the Israeli government, from the ambassador, for making trouble for them. I'm sorry. I said, listen, I have a conscience, and we have a certain set of priorities, and Jewish history and Jewish people are super important to us, and that's why we exist. And we're not going to stop, for example, protesting against neo-Nazi marches.
Efraim, what is very sad for me, that I fight for Jewish people and for memory of Holocaust, and more than Jewish state does it. That's what I feel.
Okay, but you don't have to worry about Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. They're not threatening you personally.
No. I'm still saying they could go and think about the victims and whisper to Lithuanian government, remove the monuments for murders.
Rūta, I'm telling you, I've tried for the last 25 years to do it. And to be honest, the most successful thing I did was writing the book with you. And that's precisely why I wanted to write the book with you, because I realized when the message comes from me, a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn with a kippah on his head and a New York accent.
Message to whom?
What?
Message to whom? To Israel?
Lithuanian society. To Lithuanian society.
Message to Israel.
I tried that also. And I have to say, I was not successful. I admit it.
So this book didn't change the Israeli perception.
How? Listen, it's very difficult for one person to do it. It's very difficult for one NGO to do it.
We are two.
We were the NGO that did the most on this issue.
Efraim, with this book, we're two.
Okay.
No,
thank you.
And Christoph Dickman also. No, we're three.
Right.
Okay. That's a really interesting discussion, and I think probably one you could spend a lot longer on. Tali Nates just dropped off the call, but she's joining us again. But I wondered if I could just move on to another question. There's a question from Belinda Abramowitz, who says that when she visited Poswell in 2009 with her late dad, who had left there when he was 6 in 1938, the local population was warm towards him. And she asks, is this representative of modern Lithuanians? And I wondered perhaps maybe Rūta, you could answer that question.
You know, it's difficult to say because like people, some of the people, I mean, like our book split Lithuania in two. Some of them that think, you know, Jews deserved what, got what they deserved, and others are very sympathetic. So it depends to whom you are talking to.
A lot depends on why the people came to visit. If they came to visit to get back their property, that's one thing. They'd probably look at them askance. If they're coming just to say, you know, to enjoy the nostalgia and say hello, that's something completely different.
Right.
Okay. Just a different question from Claudia. She says, do South African Jews who accept Lithuanian citizenship help to whitewash their history?
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Listen, I'm not in the position to dictate people who have only a South African passport what to do with themselves. But I would say that it's painful. It's painful for me to hear that Litvak Jews want to get a Lithuanian passport, which for me is a symbol of the past, of the story to some degree.
No, I don't agree. Lithuania is a nice country and there are a lot of wonderful people. And if they get Lithuanian citizenship, it's okay. But after getting Lithuanian citizenship, they should do something about it.
Okay. I think I'm going to let Tali close the session, I think.
Sure. I just am very, very curious. And I'm going to ask my 2 questions because I'm really curious. Efraim, I start with you because I mean, you dedicated your life, you know, to seeking justice through hunting Nazis, through putting them on trial. Now, this book is another form of justice. It's different. And I wonder how that felt for you. You know, not chase the Nazis, but write the book with Rūta and go through the journey with Rūta.
Okay, I'll explain to you the background and you'll understand the answer very simply. The Lithuanians had an excellent opportunity to prosecute Nazi war criminals who had run away to the United States. And many of the Lithuanian collaborators went to the United States. They went all over the Anglo-Saxon world, by the way, to Canada, to UK, Australia, New Zealand, all those countries. But in the United States, they couldn't be prosecuted for the crimes because the crimes were committed outside the United States and the victims were not American. So all the Americans could do was prosecute them for immigration and naturalization violations. In other words, they were asked questions when they tried to immigrate. They were asked questions when they became citizens, the same questions, and they lied. So the punishment was getting stripped of their citizenship and getting deported. Almost all of those who were stripped of their citizenship chose to come back to Lithuania. Now, that meant that the legal infrastructure to bring them to justice was already there, done by the Americans, and all they had to do was put them on trial on criminal charges. And some of these people were big criminals, like Lelekis, who was head of the Vilna security department, had 100 people under him who guarded the Vilna ghetto, who took the people to Ponar to be murdered, his deputy, Kazishkim Jauskas. And if these trials would have taken place correctly, it would have been a very important lesson for Lithuanian society. But what the Lithuanians did was they turned the whole process into a joke. What do I mean? When the people arrived in Lithuania, they were healthy enough to be prosecuted. They waited till they were medically unfit to be prosecuted. Then they passed 3 laws in the Semas, in the Lithuanian parliament. A genocide suspect can be investigated even if he's not fit. A genocide suspect can be charged, even if he's not fit. You can have a trial on a video hookup, even from a hospital. None of them was obligated to even go to the court to hear the charges. No, not one of them sat one day in prison, okay? No punishment, no crime, maybe nothing happened. So I was already at my wit's end, to be honest. When I met Rūta for the first time in 2015, it was clear we had run out of suspects. So it was clear that the fight is moving from the courtroom to the public arena, okay? And the fight became a fight not to punish people, but to ensure the accuracy of the historical narrative. And for me, when Rūta admitted to me that her family had been involved, I said, you know what? I can't convince them, but maybe Rūta can. She's a popular author, maybe the most popular author in Lithuania. If she tells them what happened, and she knows what happened because she did the research and her own family was involved, we stand a better chance. There's no question that the biggest achievement was not the 3 trials. It was the book that I wrote with Rūta. Rūta wrote with me. She mainly wrote. It made an enormous impact. The first printing, you know, the only reason this book was published was because Rūta was such a popular author and because she threatened her publisher that if they don't print this book, she's going to go to a different publisher. Because her previous book had sold 50,000 copies in a country of 2.5 million people. So she was like the goose that laid the golden eggs. And they didn't want to lose her. So that's why the book was published. By the way, their condition, Alma Litera, the publisher, was that she not tell anybody what the book is about until the day of the launch. And my name, I agreed that my name would not be on the book, also for fear that people wouldn't buy it. In all the other editions, it's on the book.
So it was a long journey, but the book is out and it's important. And there are many comments, many questions that we could not get to because, of course, the time is running out. What we will do is we will send to you, Rūta and Efraim, all the comments, all the questions, and maybe if you wouldn't mind, you will answer some of them, and then we can share that on email with all the people that came to this webinar. People really are curious to know about the Jewish community today in Lithuania. They are curious about anti-Semitism today in Lithuania, and some people shared their experiences nowadays. So we can do that if you don't mind.
Tali, listen, just one thing. First of all, I'll be happy to answer any questions that are directed to me. If people want to follow me on Twitter, it's at E capital Z UROFF. I'm on Facebook. Wiesenthal Center has a very big website with a lot of information. I invite people to go there to wiesenthal.com, and if we can help in any way, answer the questions by all means.
Absolutely.
Thank you for participating.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Absolutely, and thank you, Rūta, and thank you, Efraim, for joining us, for taking so many of the questions, for sharing with us readings from the book, and for your reflections. I'm sure that there is much more that you could have shared, but of course, we do have to end. So thank you, Rūta. Thank you, Efraim.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone.
Maybe when Corona is over, you'll bring us to South Africa so we can go to all the communities.
But I do hope that people will read the book. As I said, it is translated to English. It is now going to come out in Hebrew. It is
out in Hebrew already. It's out in Hebrew. It's in Polish, Hebrew, Swedish, Russian, Lithuanian, English, and this year Ukrainian and Japanese.
Oh,
and we hope
excellent.
other languages as well.
Excellent, excellent. So please go either Kindle or loot.co.za or Amazon Is it available on audio or Audible? Do you know?
That I'm not sure. I don't think so. I'm not sure. But they should go to Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or even the Wiesenthal Center's bookstore has the book. And
okay, brilliant.
They're even selling it in Romania for some reason.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the whole team. Thank you for all of you for coming. Please join us next week on the 21st of July at 4 o'clock for our next webinar with Dr. David Deutsch from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, speaking about Nazi propaganda and those targeted by it. Thank you again, and good night.
To my relatives. Thank you to all my relatives in South Africa and those in Israel also.
Thank you.